We never really intended to make you a permanent part of our family." My mother said it as if she were stating a simple fact. Her voice was completely calm. No hesitation. No guilt. Just a straightforward statement. And the strangest part was that she was saying all of this at my birthday dinner. I had just turned 26. We were sitting in a large family restaurant in the city. It was Friday night, so almost every table was full. People were laughing, waiters were walking around carrying trays, and somewhere in the background, soft country music was playing. Everything seemed normal. Except for our table. I looked at my mother. Lorraine Carter. For 26 years, I had called her Mom. She was sitting comfortably in her chair, as if she had just made a casual comment about the weather. My father, Daniel Carter, was sitting next to her. He picked up his cup of coffee and slowly took a sip. Then he looked at me. "You're 26 now," he said. His voice was just as calm. "That means our responsibility is over." For a few seconds, I couldn't even process what he had just said. 26 years. For 26 years, I believed that these two people were my parents. They sent me to school. They watched me go to college. Every year, they cut my birthday cake with me. At least, that's what I thought. My mother took out a folded piece of paper from her bag and placed it on the table. "We had already made this decision," she said. Her fingers rested on top of that paper. "Now you'll have to handle your life on your own." I looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. People at the nearby tables were busy with their own conversations. No one had any idea what kind of discussion was happening at our table. My father cleared his throat lightly. "Look," he said, "we did what we did for you because we believed it was our responsibility. But every responsibility has a time limit." My mother nodded. "And now that time is over." For a few seconds, I sat there completely silent. The strange thing was, I didn't feel like crying. I didn't feel angry either. In fact, I didn't feel anything at all. Because the truth was, this conversation wasn't as sudden for me as my parents thought it was. For the past 8 months, I had been expecting this moment. I slowly leaned back against my chair and looked at them. Both of them seemed to be waiting for a reaction. Maybe tears. Maybe anger. Maybe a question. But I did none of those things. I simply sat there quietly. Then I slowly opened my bag. My fingers touched the envelope I had been carrying with me for several weeks. My mother was still talking. "We know this won't be easy for you to hear, but..." I interrupted her mid-sentence. "Are you both finished?" They both suddenly went silent. For the first time, a slight confusion appeared in my mother's eyes. "Why?" she asked. With a faint smile, I placed that envelope on the table. "Because," I said calmly. "Now it's my turn." And my parents had absolutely no idea yet that a few people sitting in this restaurant had already been waiting for this conversation to happen. After hearing my words, my mother's eyes narrowed for a few seconds, as if she was suddenly trying to understand why I had responded that way. My father also leaned slightly toward me. Maybe they expected me to start crying. Maybe they thought I would bombard them with questions. But when none of that happened, the atmosphere became strangely tense. My mother said slowly, "What do you mean?" I lightly placed my fingers on the envelope, but I didn't open it yet. The sounds inside the restaurant became clear again, the clinking of glasses somewhere, a child's laughter, the footsteps of a waiter passing by. Everything was normal. But at our table, there was a silence that felt separate from the rest of the world. I looked at my mother and father. Then I said calmly, "You've already said what you wanted to say." My mother gave a small nod. "Yes," she said. "We thought this was the right time to tell you the truth." The same strange calmness was still on her face, as if she had just completed a difficult task. My father gestured toward the paper on the table. "These are just formalities," he said. "It's just some paperwork." I looked at that paper again, but I didn't pick it up. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair. "Interesting," I said. My mother's eyebrows tightened slightly. "Interesting," she repeated. I nodded. "Yes." For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then my mother asked slowly, Why are you so calm?" The question probably came to her suddenly. Because the truth was, my reaction was nothing like what they had expected. They probably thought I would break down. But I didn't. I just kept looking at them. And maybe that was what was making them uncomfortable. My father shifted slightly in his chair and said, "If you have something to say, then say it." I took a small breath. Then I gently slid the envelope a little forward with my fingers. "You know," I said slowly, "tonight's conversation isn't as shocking for me as you think it is." Both of them looked at me at the same time. For the first time, a slight tension appeared on my father's face. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. I looked straight into his eyes. "I'm just saying," I replied calmly, "that I was ready for this moment." My mother immediately sat up straighter. "Ready?" she said. I nodded. "Yes." For a few seconds, the three of us just looked at each other. People in the restaurant were busy in their own worlds, but it felt as if time had slowed down around our table. My mother's voice was a little firmer now. "How did you know we were going to talk about this today?" I gave a faint smile. "I didn't know you would say it tonight," I said. "But I did know that one day you would." My father's fingers began tapping lightly on the table. It was an old habit of his. Whenever he was under stress, he did that. "How can you say that?" he asked. I slowly looked at the envelope, then back at them. "Because," I said, "8 months ago I found something that I probably was never supposed to see." My mother's face suddenly became a little tense. "What did you find?" she asked immediately. I picked up the envelope, but still didn't open it. "A file," I said. "In the basement." And at that moment, I remembered that night 8 months ago, when I had sat in front of that file for the first time, the one that changed the meaning of my entire life. That night from 8 months ago is still crystal clear in my mind. It was a Saturday. My mother had sent a short message to my phone early that morning. "Clean the basement today. Brittany is going to store her things there next week." Brittany was my cousin. She had recently gone through a breakup and was moving back to the city. My mother had always wanted the basement to stay perfectly clean and organized. But the truth was, the basement was never completely clean. Old boxes, Christmas decorations, broken chairs, and my father's fishing gear were always piled up there. That afternoon I arrived at the house and went straight down to the basement. The cold cement floor smelled slightly damp. A little sunlight was coming in through the small window above. I started sliding old boxes aside one by one. For a while, everything was completely normal. Old photographs, Christmas lights, old newspapers. Then my eyes landed on a box placed behind the water heater. That box was different from the others. It was sealed with thick tape, and my mother's name was written on top in black marker. Lorraine. I stared at it for a few seconds. Technically, I shouldn't have opened it. But the human mind is strange. When something looks clearly hidden, the urge to see it only grows stronger. I pulled the box out. A thin layer of dust rose into the air. I removed the tape and opened the lid. Inside, there was only one manila folder. Just one. I picked it up. And at that moment I felt a strange sensation, like I had just picked up something that could change my life. I opened the folder. The very first document on top was an official paper. Adoption certificate. For a few seconds, I couldn't even understand what I was looking at. My fingers slowly moved across the paper. Under it was another document. A birth certificate. But it wasn't the birth certificate I had always seen. A different name was written on it. Baby girl Dunbar. I read it twice. Then a third time. My heart was beating faster now. There was another paper inside the folder. A receipt. From a tax consultant. One line on it was highlighted with a yellow marker. Adoption tax credit. $5,400. I sat there for a few seconds. Then slowly sat down on the cold cement floor. Memories from the past 26 years began running through my mind one by one. Every time my mother told the neighbors how much of a sacrifice it had been to adopt me. Every time my father avoided questions about my childhood photos. Every time someone asked why I looked so different from them. and I always laughed it off. But that day, everything started to feel different. I sat there for almost 40 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just kept thinking. Then I took out my phone. I dialed only one number. Claire. She was my best friend. She answered on the second ring. "What happened?" she asked. My voice sounded unfamiliar even to me. "I need to see you right now," I said. "Right now?" "Yes." There was a short silence. Then she asked, "What's going on?" I looked at the folder again, and quietly said, "I think my entire life was a lie." Claire met me in the small parking lot outside the city. That place was usually empty. There was only a small veterinary clinic nearby where both of us worked. When I stepped out of my car, she was already standing there. The moment she saw me, she said, "Are you okay?" I didn't answer. I simply took the birth certificate out of my jacket pocket and handed it to her. Claire took the paper and started reading it under the car light. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then she quietly said, "Dunbar?" I nodded. "Have you ever heard that name before?" she asked. "Never," I said. She stayed silent for a moment. Then she folded the paper and looked at me. "Do you remember what I gave you for Christmas?" I frowned slightly. Then suddenly I remembered. "DNA kit," I said. It was one of those online ancestry tests people use to find their family history. I hadn't even opened the kit yet. It was sitting in my bathroom drawer, still sealed in plastic. "Use it tonight," Claire said. I looked at her for a few seconds. "And what if I find something I don't want to know?" I asked quietly. Claire shrugged. "Then at least you'll know the truth." That night I went back home. The lights were on in the main house upstairs. My mother was probably watching TV. My father was probably sitting on the couch, silent as always. Everything looked completely normal. But something inside me had changed. I went into my small apartment, opened the bathroom drawer, and took out the DNA kit. My hands were trembling slightly while opening the plastic package. The instructions inside the kit were very simple. Take a swab from inside the cheek. Place it into the small tube and seal it. I did everything slowly, as if I were performing a delicate experiment in a laboratory. When it was finished, I sealed the small envelope. A tracking code was printed on it. I put on my jacket and picked up my car keys. It was around 11 at night. The city was almost asleep. I stopped in front of the post office. There was a blue mailbox outside. I held the envelope in my hand for a few seconds, then finally dropped it inside. The envelope hit the metal wall and slid down. A soft sound echoed. And at that moment I realized there was no turning back anymore. The results were supposed to take 6 weeks. 6 weeks. For 6 weeks I had to live as if everything was normal. And that was the hardest part. In the following days, I started looking at my mother differently. Every word she said, every habit, every story, began to feel different. Whenever she told the neighbors, "We adopted her, we gave her everything." There was pride in her voice. But now I started hearing something else in it. Something I had never noticed before. My father remained silent, just as always. Whenever the topic came up, he would suddenly start staring at his shoes, as if something on the floor had suddenly become very interesting. Every Sunday, I still went to dinner with them. I still said, "Thanks, Mom." I kept smiling. But deep inside, I was waiting for only one thing. The truth. And the truth finally arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my car in the clinic's parking lot. It was my lunch break. I was scrolling on my phone, when suddenly a notification appeared on the screen. Ancestry result ready. My hands suddenly felt cold. I opened the link. The screen loaded slowly. And then a name appeared. Helen Dunbar. Relationship. Parent. At that moment, it felt as if the world had stopped for a few seconds. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Relationship. Parent. Those words kept repeating in front of my eyes. My mind still couldn't fully believe it. I moved the phone a little farther away and looked again. The name was still the same. Helen Dunbar. There was a small photo on her profile. A woman, probably in her late 40s. Short brown hair. A tired but warm smile. She was standing in front of a small garden. Below the profile, there was some basic information. Location: Ridgemorne. Occupation: community health nurse. Married to Tom Dunbar. And one more line. Son: Cody, 20. I read that line twice. Then a third time. I had a brother. The thought felt strange in my mind. Like learning a new word. I leaned back in the car seat. I was still holding the half-eaten granola bar in my hand, but I suddenly had no appetite at all. I sat there for almost 15 minutes. The phone was in my hand. The screen was still open. But I couldn't do anything. Only one question kept circling in my mind. Should I message her? If I write to her, my entire life might change. If I don't, I might never know the truth. I opened the phone again. The cursor was blinking inside the message box. For the first time, I started typing. Hello. I think you might be my biological mother. I wrote an entire paragraph. Then I read it. And deleted everything. The second time, I wrote it differently. But again, the words felt too heavy. As if with every line, I was opening another door in my life. I deleted that message too. Third time, fourth time, fifth time. Each time it felt like I either sounded too emotional, or too cold. The sixth time, I wrote a very short message. 3 lines. Just 3. Hello. My name is Paige. I believe you might be my biological mother. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then took a deep breath, and pressed send. The message was sent. Now nothing was in my control anymore. I locked my phone, and held it against my chest. The sun was slowly setting behind the trees in the parking lot. I thought maybe it would take days for a reply, or maybe it would never come. But 4 hours later, my phone vibrated. I immediately looked at the screen. A new message. Helen Dunbar. My fingers suddenly turned cold. I opened the message. There was only one line. I have been waiting for this message for 25 years. I read it twice. Then a third time. My eyes were starting to blur. But I wasn't crying. Not yet. I was just sitting in the car, realizing for the first time that maybe my life had another side to it. For the next 3 months, I lived in 2 different worlds. One world was the one I had always known. My small apartment. My parents' house. Sunday dinners. And the other world was in Ridgemorne, where Helen lived. The first time I arrived at her house, she opened the door and looked at me as if she couldn't believe I was actually standing there. Her hands were trembling slightly. She said, "Hi." That was all. Then a few seconds later, tears filled her eyes. Behind her stood a man, Tom, and behind him, a tall young guy, Cody, my brother. Tom shook my hand and said, "Welcome home, kid." At that moment, I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Happiness, nervousness, or both. But one thing was clear. In Ridgemorne, for the first time, I felt like someone genuinely wanted to know me. And maybe that's why. 3 months later, when my parents invited me to dinner for my 25th birthday, I already knew that night wasn't going to be ordinary. My 25th birthday was on a Friday. And that evening, my mother sent me a message. "We'll have dinner at Maggie's tonight. Just the 3 of us." Maggie's was the most popular restaurant in this small town. Wooden walls, warm yellow lighting. And every Friday night, almost the entire town showed up there. I read the message and held my phone in my hand for a few seconds. Somewhere deep inside my chest, a strange uneasiness rose. In the past 5 years, my mother had hardly ever taken me out for dinner on my birthday. But this time, her voice on the phone had suddenly sounded very sweet. "We have something important to tell you," she had said. I knew this was the conversation I had been waiting for during the last 8 months. But this time, I wouldn't be alone. That evening, I arrived at Maggie's a little early. The restaurant was already almost full. The smell of butter and cornbread was coming from the kitchen. People were laughing. Plates were clinking somewhere. Everything seemed normal. But inside me, nothing felt normal. I glanced toward the corner of the room. At a table near the window, 3 people were sitting. Helen, Tom, and Cody. Helen looked at me. Our eyes met. She gave a very small nod. That was all. We had already decided that they wouldn't come near our table until I gave the signal. My heart was beating fast. But my walk was completely calm. I walked to the table in the middle and sat down. A few minutes later, the door opened. And my parents walked in. My mother was wearing a red dress. It was the same dress she usually wore to church or special occasions. My father was quiet, as always. They walked to my table and sat down across from me. "Happy birthday," my mother said with a smile. I nodded slightly. The waiter came. My mother ordered wine. My father ordered water. I didn't order anything. For a few minutes, we talked about small things. They asked about the clinic. I gave short answers. But I could clearly see that my mother was waiting to begin the real conversation. Finally, she folded her fingers together on the table. It was her old habit. Whenever she was about to say something serious, she always sat like that. She said quietly, "Paige, we need to tell you something." I said nothing. I just kept looking at her. She took a deep breath. And then said, "You're not our real daughter." Inside the restaurant, the other sounds suddenly seemed quieter to me, as if someone had lowered the volume. My mother leaned forward. "We adopted you when you were only 3 days old," she said. My father stayed silent. His eyes were fixed on his plate. My mother continued speaking. "At that time, we were in a very difficult financial situation," she said. Then she gave a strange smile. "But the adoption tax credit helped us a lot." Nothing inside me moved. Because I already knew all of this. She continued. "But now you're 25. All those benefits are over." My father cleared his throat quietly. "We've also spoken to a lawyer," he said. My mother took a piece of paper out of her purse and slid it across the table toward me. "These are just formal documents," she said. "You'll need to move out of the house within the next 30 days. I looked at the paper, then into my mother's eyes. For a few seconds, we both remained silent. Then I said quietly, "That's it." My mother's smile suddenly disappeared. "What do you mean?" she asked. I tilted my head slightly and said calmly, "I thought you would say a little more than that." My mother's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I could clearly see that my reaction had completely ruined her script. She had expected me to break down, but I was sitting there completely calm, and the envelope inside my bag was still waiting for my fingers. After I said, "That's it," a strange silence spread across the table. My mother stared at me for a few seconds, as if she couldn't understand why I hadn't reacted the way she expected. My father shifted slightly in his chair. His fingers began tapping lightly on the table. It was an old habit of his. Whenever he felt uncomfortable, he did that. My mother's voice became slightly firmer. "Paige, we know this isn't easy to hear." I nodded. "Yes," I said calmly, "but it probably isn't easy for you to say either." She stayed silent for a moment. Then suddenly her patience cracked a little. "Look," she said, "we raised you. We gave you a home. Food. We sent you to school." I slowly looked at the paper lying on the table. Then back at her. "And you also received $5,400 a year," I said. My mother's face changed immediately. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the wine glass. "How do you know that number?" she asked sharply. For the first time, my father looked directly at me. I didn't answer for a few seconds. I just kept looking at them. It was the kind of silence that always made my mother uncomfortable. Finally she snapped, "Are you going to say something?" I slowly reached toward my bag, but I still didn't take the envelope out. "You know," I said. "What's interesting?" My mother narrowed her eyes. "What?" I said. "You think that tonight you've told me some truth that I didn't already know." My father's fingers stopped tapping on the table. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. I looked into his eyes. "I'm just saying. I already knew all of this." My mother sat up straight. "Impossible," she said immediately. I took a slow breath. 8 months ago," I said. "I found a file in the basement." My father's face turned slightly pale. For a moment, panic flashed in my mother's eyes. But she quickly recovered. "Since when do you go through other people's things?" she said with contempt. I shrugged. "Maybe since the day I realized my entire life had been filed away next to a tax document." A man at the table beside us turned his head slightly to look in our direction. My mother immediately lowered her voice. "This isn't the place for this conversation," she said. I smiled faintly. "Then why did you invite me here?" She didn't answer. For a few seconds, the only sounds at the table were the normal noises of the restaurant. Then my mother leaned forward and said quietly, "You need to understand that your real mother abandoned you." I immediately raised my hand to stop her. "Stop." She froze. My voice was firmer now. "You will not say anything about her." My mother laughed. A cold, mocking laugh. "You don't even know her," she said. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out the white envelope. I placed it slowly on the table. My mother's eyes immediately locked onto it. "What is that?" she asked. I didn't answer. I just rested my fingers on the envelope. My father leaned slightly forward. "Paige, what's in that?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, then at my mother, and calmly said, "You were just saying that my real mother abandoned me." I gently slid the envelope toward them. "The interesting thing is," I said, "I met her 8 months ago." My mother's face froze completely, as if time had suddenly stopped. Then I said the next sentence, "And she's sitting in this restaurant right now." After I said, "She's sitting in this restaurant right now," my mother remained completely still for a few seconds, as if her mind couldn't process what I had just said. My father leaned forward slightly and asked, "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer. I simply looked toward the corner of the restaurant where the table near the window was. My mother followed my gaze. Her eyes began searching through the crowd. And at that exact moment, Helen slowly stood up from her chair. Tom stood up as well. Cody straightened his jacket and stood behind them. The 3 of them began walking toward our table. Several people in the restaurant were now watching them. No one said anything, but the atmosphere had suddenly grown heavy. My mother's eyes were now wide open. "What kind of drama is this?" she whispered. I said only one word. "The truth." Helen stopped beside our table. She looked at me for a few seconds. Then she gently placed her hand on my shoulder. Her hand was warm, but slightly trembling. She looked at my mother and said very calmly, "Hello." My mother immediately stood up. The sound of her chair scraping echoed across the restaurant. "Who are you?" she demanded loudly. Helen didn't rush her answer. She looked at me, then at my mother. "My name is Helen Dunbar," she said. "And Paige is my daughter." My mother's face turned red instantly. "That's nonsense," she snapped. My father half rose from his chair and stared at Helen. The nervousness on his face was obvious. "This wasn't necessary," he said. Tom had remained quiet until now, but he stepped forward. His voice was calm, but firm. "We're not here to fight," he said. "We're here for Paige." My mother looked at me. Anger was now clearly visible in her eyes. "You planned all of this," she said. I nodded. "Yes." Her laughter suddenly became sharp and bitter. "So you thought you would embarrass me here in front of everyone?" I replied calmly, "No. I just didn't want to be alone when you decided to abandon me." My mother stared at me for a few seconds. Then suddenly she pointed a finger at me. "Do you even know who your real mother was?" she said. "She was an irresponsible girl who abandoned you." "Stop." This time, the word came from Helen. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was strong enough that my mother immediately fell silent. Helen looked straight into my mother's eyes. "I did not abandon my daughter," she said quietly. "I was 22. Alone. And my family forced me. By now, almost every table in the restaurant was watching us. My mother glanced around. For the first time, she seemed to realize that this conversation was no longer confined to our table. My father spoke quietly. "Lorraine, maybe we should leave." But my mother was still angry. "No," she said. Then she looked at me. "If you think this makes you special, you're wrong." I picked up the envelope and took out the photograph inside it. The one where I was standing with Helen and Tom. I placed it on the table. "No," I said. "This doesn't make me special." I took Helen's hand and said softly, "This just makes me finally belong to someone." The moment I said, "This makes me truly belong to someone," silence fell over the table again. My mother stared at the photo for a few seconds. In the picture, I was standing between Helen and Tom. All three of us were smiling. The kind of smile that isn't meant for a camera, but for a real moment. My mother slowly picked up the photo. She looked at it for a few seconds. Then she threw it back onto the table. "This is all nonsense," she said. Her voice was trembling slightly now. My father had been silent until then. But it was obvious from his face that he felt uncomfortable about the entire situation. Tom stood quietly. His eyes weren't on my mother, they were on me. As if he was only checking whether I was okay. My mother suddenly glanced around the restaurant. Now she could clearly see that people were watching us. Some were even whispering quietly. That was the one thing my mother had always feared. What people would think. She immediately leaned toward me and said in a low voice, "End this right now." I shook my head. This has only just begun. Her eyes narrowed. "You want to humiliate me in front of everyone?" I replied calmly, "No. You already did that yourself." My father finally pushed his chair back. He stood up. "Enough," he said quietly. "Lorraine, we should leave." My mother glared at him. "You're really going to walk out?" He didn't answer. He simply picked up his jacket. A few seconds later, he started walking toward the door. It was probably the first time he had left my mother alone in a public place. My mother stood there for a moment, as if she didn't know what to do next. Then she looked back at me. Now there was something else in her eyes besides anger. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe fear. "You think this is a victory?" she said. I shook my head. "No. This isn't a victory." I picked up the paper on the table, the one she wanted me to sign, then placed it back in front of her. "This is just the truth." For a few seconds, we looked at each other. Then she picked up her purse. Without saying another word, she turned around and walked toward the door. The sound of her heels echoed across the wooden floor. People in the restaurant moved slightly aside to give her space. The door opened, then closed, and with it, an entire chapter of my life closed as well. I slowly sat down in the chair. For the first time, I realized how fast my heart was beating. Helen gently took my hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. I took a deep breath, then gave a small smile. "Yes." Tom pulled out a chair and sat down. "So, what's the plan now?" he asked. Cody immediately said, "First, food." I suddenly laughed. The laugh sounded a little strange, but it was real. A few minutes later, Maggie herself came to our table. She placed 4 plates down, then smiled and said, "Dinner tonight is on me." Tom replied, "You didn't have to do that." Maggie shook her head. "Maybe not." Then she looked at me. "But tonight this town saw something real." Then she walked away. A little later, the food arrived. And slowly the restaurant returned to normal. But at our table, a new beginning was sitting there. For the first time, someone was asking me questions and genuinely listening to the answers. For the first time, someone was looking at me simply because they wanted to know me. And that night I finally understood something. Sometimes, family isn't made by blood. Family is made by the person who never stops looking for you. But I didn't know yet that this story still had one final turn left. When we walked out of Maggie's that night, the air was slightly cold. The warm yellow lights of the restaurant stayed behind us. I paused for a few seconds between the parked cars in the lot. Everything suddenly felt very quiet, as if a huge part of my life had just ended, and a new one was about to begin. Helen stood beside me. She asked softly, "Would you like to come with us tonight?" There was hope in her voice, and fear too, as if she was already preparing herself for whatever answer I gave. I looked at her, then at Tom, then at Cody, who was standing near the car looking at his phone. And suddenly I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. "Yes," I said. Helen's eyes immediately lit up. She hugged me. The hug felt strange, because we had just come into each other's lives. But somehow, it also felt completely right. The drive to Ridgemorn was about 2.5 hours. All four of us were in the same car. Sometimes someone would say something. Sometimes we were all quiet. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like an old connection slowly finding its place again. By the time we reached Ridgemorn, it was already late at night. Their house was at the edge of the town. A small lawn in front, a line of trees behind it. Helen opened the door. "Welcome home," she said softly. That word stirred something inside me. Home. I had heard that word thousands of times before. But for the first time, it felt like it might mean something different. Over the next few weeks, my life slowly began to change. I moved my belongings out of my old apartment. In total, just 4 boxes. 7 years of life. Inside 4 boxes. Claire came to help me. We loaded everything into the car and drove to Ridgemorn. A few days later, I started working at a small veterinary clinic there. Dr. Patel's clinic. Small, but good. Cody and I watched movies on Saturdays. He always picked horror movies. I always refused. And in the end, we watched action movies. Tom didn't talk much. But one day he took me into the garage and said, "Today I'm going to teach you how to change a tire." I was 26 years old. Maybe I should have learned that when I was 16. But that day I didn't feel embarrassed. I just felt a strange kind of happiness. Every year on March 15th, Helen lit a candle. On my birthday. For 25 years. Even though she didn't know where I was, how I was, or even if I was alive. This year, we lit that candle together. On the window of my small new apartment. Now I had a place of my own. $650 a month. 2nd floor. Trees outside the window. And every bill in my name. No tax credit. No arrangement. Just me, Paige. Sometimes Glenn sends me a message. Every Tuesday. Just 2 words. "Hope you're well." I reply, "I am." Maybe one day we'll have a longer conversation. Maybe we won't. But now that decision is mine. Helen and I are still learning how to understand each other. Sometimes she apologizes for the years she wasn't with me. I stop her. Because some relationships don't need to be perfect. They just need to be real. I spent 25 years being someone's tax benefit. But now, I'm simply someone's daughter. And honestly, that is far more valuable. And if you've listened to this story until here, then maybe some part of it touched your heart too. So I want to ask you a question. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you realized that a relationship you believed in was actually something completely different? If yes, then write just 2 words in the comments. I understand. I read every comment. And if you enjoy listening to true, deep, and human stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because the next story might make you think even more deeply. Until then, take care of yourself. And most importantly, never forget to respect your own boundaries.